I saw students really coming alive and really taking ownership of the piece versus it was something that they were doing for me.
I think the process approach to writing is just another way of bringing out what is the natural evolution of thought anyway.
The writing process is a thinking process, and it helps students do the kind of thinking that helps them shape and form a piece of writing, and then finally polish it and edit it. Very important that students get used to the idea of putting their ideas, their feelings, their thoughts down on paper. The sooner they do that, the more comfortable they become with it, and they develop what we call fluency. They become fluent writers that can, anytime you ask them to, can manage to get ideas and feelings down on paper. A lot of research and discussions with writers have shown that there are certain phases that writers go through as they produce a polished, finished piece. And what we're trying to do is to get students to engage in this process, to find ideas to write about, think hard about those ideas, and then take them through various steps and stages that form them, shape them, and polish them. And this is what writers do when they write. So we're turning young people into writers in the truest sense of the word.
With a process writing piece, it allows the kid to really think about his or her writing, you know, and also change focus. Topics, like I said, you may want to put this aside and start anew and start a whole new rough draft on the new paper. After the first draft, if Billy sees that this isn't working for him, you know what? I have the opportunity to trash it and maybe start over at the beginning process and take on another focus.
Well, I think the writing process is fluid. It doesn't just go in step-by-step fashion. It's experimenting, it's revising, it might be going back to experimenting before getting to that final draft. And I think the big thing is for students to understand that the first time you put something down is not always the end result, and that there's a lot more that they can explore.
The more traditional approach was what we call the product approach. And that's where the teacher focused most of his or her energy on helping students create a piece of writing that was a final, finished product. And they taught forms and formulas. The paragraph that started with a topic sentence and had 3 supports and then a final concluding clincher sentence. So the emphasis was all on the product, and very little help was given to the students who were working their way to reach this product. The student was on his or her own. The catalyst for the process approach to the teaching of writing was probably the Dartmouth Conference in 1966. Americans and British came together, English educators, to talk about teaching English. The model that the British set forth was a personal growth model. This is a model in which the students' attitudes, experiences, feelings, interests all come into play as you're creating curriculum. You don't use a curriculum that's superimposed on the students no matter who they are. You find out who your students are and you work toward their personal growth. The Americans were very turned on by this, very excited about the process and the prospect of it. People began to think about changing what was happening in the classroom. And then through the late 60s and early 70s, a lot of work was done in which writers talked about how they wrote, and we began to think in terms of how might we teach writing that will somehow make use of this knowledge of how writers write. And then about 1975, the Bay Area Writing Project began. The premise behind the Bay Area Writing Project was that writing teachers need to be writers. So that the project had teachers learning about writing, doing a lot of reading about the most recent research, talking to each other, sharing their best practices, From this, we got textbooks that people began to produce in the late 70s and early 80s that really helped teachers decide how they were going to be teaching writing as a process, rather than as a formula to be followed, and rather than all this emphasis we had on the final product. I think just allowing a gentle hum of noise where students are permitted to chat with each other about the writing and to share their work helps to create a much more comfortable atmosphere. A corner set aside where there are handbooks, samples of other students' writing, samples of professional writing, flyers, sheets that students can use that will help them get ideas, and allowing students to have free access to it, to stand up and move to that corner and work in that corner, and then come back to their seats and work. And then having the teacher get out there in the middle. Not sit up at the front desk and mark papers, but actually get into the middle of the classroom, lean over shoulders, chat with students about their writing, make suggestions, enjoy, appreciate.
The teacher's role in the process, I see as a facilitator, as a person who's going to present opportunities. Maybe you put out in front of them some concept that maybe they hadn't considered or hadn't looked at. I may show them a model of something and focus their eye on a specific device and have them experiment with that. So I don't see myself as the person that's dictating how they should do things, but I'm the person that's creating the environment and giving them, hopefully, multiple ideas and areas to experiment with.
When I walk around the classroom, I see myself analogous to a doctor. I even carry around those little manila folders that doctors carry around, where I make notes on the progress of each student. And I look at those notes and I revisit where I was with that student the last time I was there so that we can talk about progress.
Oh, I like to think of the teacher as a coach. Getting in there, working with the students, praising what's going well, making suggestions for things that aren't, asking questions. What else might you do here? Tell me more about this or that. Praising a wonderful beginning and then discussing with a student how you might possibly end the piece. Coach, supporter, a diagnostician, a fellow writer. Writing and sharing with the students, responding to the students' writing and asking the students, encouraging the students to respond to his or her writing, so that the writing classroom really becomes a place where everybody is a writer. Everybody is writing and talking about writing.
I think it's important for the students to see their teacher also as a writer, and that the teacher is taking risks, and they also like to see you as a human being, and it's a very personal thing what they put in their writing, and so I'm stepping out and I'm willing to show them and share with them my pieces, and I also ask for their feedback.
I spend a fair amount of time thinking and writing with my students. I like to write with my students because I want them to see how I go through the process. I want them to see that occasionally I'm not sure what I'm doing. Occasionally I make missteps. Many of the students I work with, nobody's ever really taken much interest in them before. They haven't had a lot of good feedback in their educational experiences. So when somebody conveys to them in that one-on-one that what you think matters and how you say it matters, and furthermore, it's important, you know, that you dedicate yourself to this task, and furthermore, you can be successful. That can be a fairly powerful motivator for students.
You have to create a very positive and very supportive environment. You have to praise like mad those early pieces that the students write. You have to let them write about things they care about. You have to have them share those in class and praise and praise and praise. One of my favorite ways of dealing with writing, especially in the very beginning, when students are unsure of themselves, is what I call PQS. Share your piece of writing, read it out loud to the class, and then praise, what do you like about this piece of writing? What questions do you have for the writer? What suggestions can you make for this piece of writing that will maybe help it become a more polished piece or a longer piece? The more praise you give, the more likely you are to have students who then become encouraged to become writers. At this point, if you're going to be nitpicking small problems and things that have to do with mechanics and grammar, you're going to turn kids off. What you want to do is focus on their ideas, give them time to write, give them the opportunity to write about things that come from within them that they really care about, and then, as I keep saying, praise what they're doing well, and just ignore the stuff that isn't working right at this moment.
Where it's a challenge is that when you have students who are used to a process format or a workshop, they understand how to be independent inquirers, where the other students are looking more for the teacher to tell them a certain way to do something, and they don't trust themselves. And so you have to build the trust and the understanding of what is the process, what is workshop, how do you take risks, and yes, it's really safe to take risks.
Some of my kids are like really resistant, especially the students who are strong in science and math. And I always have to say to them that, okay, you'll have to write a lab report. And so you want your lab report to reflect that you're a good critical thinker and that you're able to write your ideas down clearly and precisely. And so, you know, once I convey that to my kids that, you know, you don't have to be the English major to be a profound writer. So once I convey that to my kids, they're like, you know, I'm doing a lot better in my science class now because, you know, my writing is stronger. I'm able to convey my ideas more clearly, more succinctly.
Students need to read what they're writing. If they're writing personal experience stories, they need to read other students' personal experience stories, and they need to read professional, polished writers' personal experience stories, short essays and short stories that are based in reality. If they're doing argumentative papers, they need to read argumentative papers. If they're doing compare-contrast essays, they need to read what they look like.
I want them to learn to become attentive readers. I want them to look at the page and ask themselves, what does this have to do, what I'm reading right here, with what I'm writing right now? And is there a correlation between these two? What we know about really, really good writers is that they don't read like other people do. You know, I mean, they have a tendency to be curious about the text. They have a tendency to identify certain things that the writer is doing and then practice them themselves.
Writers are readers, and one of the most difficult things about teaching writing is that most students don't love to read and don't read a lot.
Oftentimes kids will say, well, I really like to increase my vocabulary. How do I go about that? And I always say to them, you need to widely read. And they're like, oh, so then they always say, well, you know, I read a lot of fiction. Okay, well, you know, be more widespread, you know, where maybe you might want to start reading about cooking. Maybe you might want to pick up a book on or a magazine about politics. Maybe you might want to pick up something from National Geographic.
A lot of the grammatical and mechanical things that we expect students to be able to do when they write, they learn from reading. And the more reading they do, the more likely they are to internalize some of these forms. Written language is different from oral language. The more reading you do, the more students are able to understand some of those forms of written language. And you want to encourage them to use that and to learn those things by reading. Usually for most writers, there's what's called a pre-writing stage. It's a period in which the writer is thinking about the piece, thinking about the ideas, generating material, doing jottings and lists and maps, brainstorming, talking about it.
Like your subject?
This occurs to get words down on paper or to get ideas in the mind before you actually start doing the drafting. One of the things you can do to get students brainstorming in the class is to put them into pairs and have them brainstorm together on the topic that they are writing about. The teacher can lead a brainstorming session and just fill up the blackboard with all the different kinds of things that students could be doing in terms of the given piece of writing. Or you can have students do individual brainstorming and then talk about it. That's very effective, to have a student generate a long list of what might possibly go into this paper that the student is going to write, and then share that with someone else, and then talk about it. So you've got talk that is supporting that writing and that brainstorming session. You can have students doing mapping, in which they put the topic in the middle of the paper and they draw lines out, and they just everything that comes to mind having to do with that paper goes around that map. They can do free writing. They can just write. Just put pen to paper, write for 10 minutes about whatever it is you're going to be writing about for this paper. Don't stop. Just keep going. And then see what you've had to say. Is there something in there you can use in your paper? Maybe you started to write your paper in the middle of that free writing session.
What I do is I give them choice. I don't say to them that, okay, today we're going to work on clustering. I've introduced to them the various skills, and, you know, I'm a list maker. You know, I would hate for someone to say that I'd have to cluster.
I like to have students do free writes where they'll write for 5 or 10 minutes. One goal of the free writing activity is to get them to trust the writing process, to trust their ability to say things that matter, but also to give themselves permission to say things maybe that don't matter. A lot of students, I think, are blocked in the writing process because they have the idea that what they write has to be immediately significant, immediately meaningful, and acceptable for public consumption. That's putting an awful lot of pressure on themselves.
Well, for me, before I write my essay, I immediately take 10 minutes to just write exactly what's on my mind. And that comes out to be a full page, whatever. And then I use that, and I just use everything I've thought about, and I put that into my essay, and I polish it up.
Well, when I first sit down, I write it out in clustering format first, and then once I do that, then I can figure out what the who's, the what's, the when's, the where's, and the why's, and the how's. Once I do that, then I can take it from there and start writing.
For each of them, there is a different way for a discovery or an epiphany to occur where they develop their own sense of self as writer. And your writing process is going to be different than my writing process. But in addition to that, your writing process will be different from one occasion to another. And making these invisible assumptions visible for the writer is what allows them to take best advantage of their skill as a writer.
It's like sleep. You eventually move into an area that's below the level of consciousness. And a lot of interesting things begin to happen there. And if you're lucky enough to get some that hit a good nerve, they're going to be better than they could ever imagine they could be in that 5 minutes than they may ever, be again, because they did what athletes all know. They got into a zone.
I think that students should be encouraged to write in all different genres and to try out all different kinds of writing. One of the best ways to get this going in the classroom is to ask students what it is they would like to write about and just begin to do some listing on the blackboard of possibilities for writing. Another thing you can do is to have students generate their own list. What are 10 possible things that you could write about? What do you know a lot about? I had a teacher once who called this treasures within you, and you were expected to keep a page going of treasures within you. And I really liked that idea of writing as being a treasure that you were then going to unlock.
For students to find topics, I think notebook generating is very important. And when they have a body of work in front of them, we look for what we call a theme or a seed idea, and that seems to be the river of issues in our lives that seem to pour out in each write. Because I do feel that if we write about the things that we know about, we're going to have a stronger piece. And so I tell them, look for those themes.
When students are in control of making their own decisions and making decisions about what they want to be as a writer, that's when the writing process can really take off. And that's important for me because it gives those students a sense of agency, a sense of acting and controlling their life.
We usually have a lot of workshop time where we have an hour and just basically write down what we feel and what we're thinking, and then we take that and then we, it's called generating. Garbage generating is just basically what you write down, and then we take that and we implicate it, or we incorporate it in our poem. I'm taking Robert Frost, and I'm trying to apprentice his, his rhythm and his sentence structure and just everything about him. I'm trying to recreate in my own way.
I think Susie has a good eye for reading a text and seeing the moves that Robert Frost was making and experimenting with that in her piece.
I'm using The Road Not Taken, which is an extremely famous poem, and like Ms. Golab told me to take that poem and try to take the extended metaphor he makes and use it in a different way, like maybe towards an object or something instead of a road not taken.
When I've met with Susie, I talked about, she had looked at using, and she had used a road as her extended metaphor, and she even said, it's been used already. It's going to become a cliche if I use it. And so she's going back and drafting ideas on what other object or thing or decision can I have where I get the same concept of, I have two options in front of me. I choose one and it could take me this direction, or the other could take me another way. So she's been going back and playing around with that.
A draft is the writer's first attempt at getting the piece into language and down on the page. And it can be a partial draft or full draft. Grammar and punctuation are totally insignificant. Students should be encouraged to get that draft down, no matter how it sounds, to just work their way through the piece and not worry about getting it correct. There'll be plenty of time later for any kind of grammatical and mechanical correctness.
A lot of times students will come to me and say, well, how do I say this, or, how do I spell this? And I always say to them that that's not what the first draft is about. You want to get your ideas down on paper as clear, as much as you can. Don't get caught up in the syntax and the diction.
A lot of drafting is discovery. You write thinking you're going to start out in one place, and you end up someplace else. Or as you're writing, you realize what you really want to say, and then you get that down. So that writing is not a mechanical transcription of what's in your mind. The process itself produces new ideas, new thoughts, discovery, concepts that you might not have considered earlier. It really is very much exploration and self-discovery. That's why it's so powerful, because it does help students think in a deeper way about the topic.
I think drafting really involves identifying the focus, identifying the thing that the writer really wants to concentrate on, and then elaboration. In the class that I'm teaching right now, I've been asking students to enumerate sentences just as an exercise that invites them to examine a sentence and see what the key idea is in that sentence, and then write 2 or 3 more sentences about that particular idea.
Where it begins to go is unpredictable, but it's going to go somewhere. It may even go into a dead end. I think that's healthy for writers to hit dead ends, because they have to ask themselves, well, what do I do now? And they come up with an answer. If you pose questions to yourself, you generally respond to the questions. It's a dialogue that happens internally between the writer and the writer.
If a student's having trouble starting, maybe that's a good time for the student to do some reading, or to go back and revise a piece done previously, maybe not quite finished. Maybe it's time for a teacher to say, refer to your treasures within you list. Maybe it's time for the student to just do some brainstorming on paper about possible things that might go into this paper that the student now has to write. Anything that will get the flow going.
When I see a student who's staring at, say, a blank screen, or if they're in their notebook and they just can't seem to get going, I'll say, I want you just to write a bunch of garbage. Or say, I'm going to write the silliest story ever, and start your story that way, and just go from there, and get past this feeling that it has to be perfect.
There are those students who are afraid to begin. because they don't trust themselves. You know, they don't have confidence in their ability to produce a text. I think that's where models come in. I mean, I think that showing them papers that other students have written can provide them with a sense of how to proceed.
So the teacher's role is to help when necessary and to get out of the way when it's not necessary, to respond and give feedback, to look for what's positive, to make suggestions, but always to give students the time, the space to get their writing out the way that they want to do it.
As a younger teacher, I used to perform a post-mortem on the draft. You know, so here's everything that's wrong and here's everything that you need to correct on a future paper that isn't even assigned yet. My inclination now is to try to engage the ideas that the students have handed in, and then through conference, and then through pointed questions, asking them to take it to the next level. In another draft, I would like you to explore this further. In another draft, I'd like you to look at this from another point of view. It's a much more stimulating way, you know, of responding to writing.
What I usually have the kids do, no matter where they are with the first draft, they're peer editing. So usually with the first draft, they're actually having dialogue around their writing. Now, it may be from that first draft that they've decided that I need to do a second or a third, but once they complete that first draft, whatever it is, they start having dialogue around it.
The lesser skilled students can learn a lot from those who are more skilled. And the more skilled students can learn to respect the thoughts and ideas of those who perhaps not so good at getting the language down on the paper, but are very good at thinking and very good at creativity. So that this kind of sharing, I think, is very helpful in the classroom and will create an environment in which everyone comes up to at least an acceptable level, if not well beyond that.
I'll ask my students to bring in a draft to class that's a peer draft, so that 2 or 3 classmates will read it.
So we're going to read, take turns reading to each other, and after we finish reading, I'd like the person who listens to respond in a couple of ways, all right?
There'll be some talk about it. They'll have an opportunity to see how an audience receives this. Then they go back and revise, you know, based on what they've heard from their peers. Also, critically, based on what they've seen their peers write, because I think it's very important that they learn from each other about the writing process.
Well, it helps me because I'm more of a reserved person. I'm keep to myself. It helps me be more interactive with other students and see how they attack the problems that he presents to us.
I tell the students in the response group that the writer should read their piece aloud, and then they are not allowed to say anything more. And I suggest that they keep their eyes on their sheet of paper and write notes, because at first it's very uncomfortable. Students feel that they need to talk directly to the writer. They want instant answers to something they don't understand. But if the writer clears up all those confusions, then the writer doesn't hear the conversation about what's not in their text.
Occasionally, I mean, I will establish a ground rule out front that mutual respect is an important value in the class, and the capacity to trust each other is important as well. But this class will work best if we trust each other, not to rip on each other and not to belittle and do that sort of thing. And by and large, you know, they're very generous. And I think they're grateful to each other, you know, for that generosity. And I think they're grateful to have so much access to each other's work.
It's good to hear other people's criticism and what they think about it and what you could do better or what you did really good.
The 2 groups that were able to argue and able to discuss and didn't kind of break off, those are the groups that were happier with the work that they produced. Response groups do a couple of things, and they're important for those things that they do. The first thing is that they create a sense of community. When students share, when writers share their lives with each other, they bond with each other. They create an emotional capital that they can use to build relationships. Another thing that it does is it gets students hearing how other people use writing to create meaning, and it allows them to evaluate and incorporate those pieces of craft into their own writing. When John came in, he didn't do anything. He never wrote. When John came in, he had a reticence about even talking to me. I had to gain his trust, and he had to understand that this was a safe place for him to experiment before he even began to write in his writer's notebook.
The character I'm working on right now is a bank robber, actually, and which he is doing wrong in robbing a bank. I think like the people's like influence on like asking you questions, like why do you do it this way? Why don't you do it this way? And or like maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you should do that, but maybe you should hold it off until later in the story and put that in. It's a chance to compromise and talk to people about their views on issues, because not everyone's going to have the same view, of course.
So what you're seeing in John, this energy, this enthusiasm, is kind of new for him. He hasn't demonstrated it much previously, but he's coming to that point, and will grow as his tricks become more sophisticated, as his craft becomes more sophisticated.
Drafting and experimenting is where you're still trying to figure out what the meaning is, and playing around with certain writer's devices. And then the revision aspect, you're going through and making sure everything is clear, that you see the meaning of the piece, and there's nothing that is distracting from that meaning of that piece.
That's, to me, is when you're delving into more depth, when you're actually refining your ideas, making them clearer, not so much syntactically, but have I included every bit of information that will make this piece stand out.
Everything that you're pointing toward as a writer comes down to revision. Revision is a re-seeing. And as somebody who re-sees something, you're looking at it from the point of view almost of being the person who didn't write that. You need to emotionally disengage from your work to see what you've written.
I like to think of the revision phase as dealing with the whole piece, dealing with the ideas behind it, the organization of the piece, the depth of the thought, working with beginnings and endings, working with the writing as a holistic piece. Then there comes a phase in which the writing is ready to be finished and polished. And that's what I call the post-writing phase. That's when you work with editing, proofreading, periods, commas, semicolons, language, getting it ready for a reader or for publication.
It's important to proofread after you revise your paper, because you can still have errors left over, and you can have misspelled words, and punctuation marks could be absent, and I do that a lot.
And I try to emphasize for them that editing is really a search. It's a search for errors that they know they are inclined to make, rather than just sort of a scanning of the paper to see if anything jumps out at them.
It's very valuable to have students do editing and proofreading with each other rather than alone. Sometimes you just can't see your own errors. You've been spelling that word that way all of your life, and you don't realize that it's a misspelled word. Or you can't see that the idea ends here and you need a period. So that I like to have students work in pairs when they are proofreading and editing each other's papers, because other students will find the mechanical, grammatical errors in student writing more than they will in their own writing.
Well, what I always say to them is to read their papers aloud. I know as a writer that when I read silently, I put in words. I know exactly what I want to say. So typically what I'll tell them to do when they think they're at that point, bring it to class, read it to a peer, read it aloud to mom, read it aloud to dad. If you have a tape recorder at home, tape it. But I always encourage the students to read it orally to someone.
First, I read it to my parents, and then they usually catch all my little proofreading mistakes and everything. Then I come to school with my final essay, and I read it to my friends. And usually they'll find one or two that I didn't catch. So I immediately run to the library right quick, and I change that up.
I'm working on a poem called Mama's Cooking, and it's about how I'm using my senses to describe how I see my mom cooking, how I smell her cooking, and just different observations, basically. It's an observation poem.
What you just explained to me is a really powerful image of your mother. And you have the comparisons, but I don't really feel like I'm seeing your mom yet. The piece that Courtney's working on, it really, I think, is something very close to her because it represents family. And her mother's cooking really represents so much about the family's togetherness, about the identity, the heritage. We know that you were talking about sensory detail, but also you wanted that rhythm, the musical quality that you were seeing in Maya Angelou.
Well, revising is kind of nerve-wracking because you do think your poem is the best that it can be, well, best to your ability, and but once you start putting in things and once people start suggesting different things, you're like, oh, that's a good idea. Maybe I'll insert that, or maybe I'll cut that, or so it really does help in the end. But at the beginning, you're just like, I don't want to touch this again. I'm done. But it's really helpful.
I think because it is so special to her about it being about her mother and her family. So I think that that's going to help Courtney carry through because it has meaning to her.
The reason that work should be published, student work should be published, or all work should be published, is because we have a commitment to one another to live in a community that values our ideas.
I think publishing is a very important part of the writing process because it gives the students' voice a chance to be heard through their writing. And whether it be in a newspaper or in the classroom, it's publishing and they're heard.
All writers need someone to respond to their work so they can see if they got their ideas across, their message came across to the reader.
It makes me want to write better, and it makes me a stronger writer to present to others because I want them to think I'm a good writer.
Being able to read, to a classmate, and if they say, well, that's pretty good, that your paper's great. I mean, that's a good feeling.
You only live once, so it's fun to go up there and share your opinions with people and then have them think about it.
There's nothing more gratifying than looking at your final product and enjoying it and realizing that you've done well, that this is a fine piece and you're proud of it. Nothing more pleasurable than putting that piece into a publication and having other people read it and comment on it. There are dozens of ways that teachers can get students to share their writing. One of the best ways is to give them real things to write about, real editorials for the student newspaper or for the local newspaper, real letters, real writing that has a place in the world and can be sent out. Another way is just to produce a classroom publication, to have everybody select the best piece and then put it together and have an anthology of student writing. And I think the teacher also should publish with students. If you're putting out a classroom anthology, teacher's piece ought to be right in there too, along with the rest of the students. You can post student writing on bulletin boards. You can have students read their pieces aloud to each other. You can have students read aloud to a small group, in pairs, or to the whole class. Ask for volunteers, and then discuss the piece of writing as if it were done by a professional writer. And all of these different ways help encourage students to want to continue to write. And you do occasionally get a student who is very shy or has written a piece that the student just doesn't want anybody else to read. It's too personal. And I think the teacher can work one-to-one with that student and can give support, can coach, can encourage. And then when the piece is finished and it's very wonderful, can ask the student if the student would be willing to share it. Sometimes the student won't want to share the piece, won't want to read it aloud, but will permit the teacher to read it. Don't force, do it gently and carefully, because you don't want to turn down the writing. You don't want them to really be turned off.
Brett is a student who I would classify as a survivor. He's gone through classes and learned how to get what he wanted out of the class without really engaging in the class. So for him now to find a real reason to write rather than a reason just to get through the class, I think is really a significant thing for him to do.
I wrote a poem about faith. So here's how it goes. When everything you believe in becomes a nightmare, a dark, twisted portal that...
So when he got up and read, and he talked about specific parts of his metaphor, that wasn't there before. And you know, it still might not be where it could be, but for him it's a big step. He's always been energetic. He's always wanted to be at center stage. Now he's learning to do those center stage things productively.
Well, it's not that big of a deal usually, because he makes this environment so nice that like everybody can share their own poems and everything without like feeling stupid. It's always good to, share your view on the world, I guess.